What is going on, everybody? Welcome to another episode of SCUM. This right here is the podcast where we dive into the deepest, darkest, murkiest waters with a plethora of legendary guests. I am, of course, your host, your bastard of ceremonies, the #1 scumbag, Rex Ruger. That's Rex with 3 X's. Count them. Uno, dos, tres. You might also know me as AKA the King of Sleaze, AKA the Hair Metal High Priest, and most importantly, AKA Diamond David Lee Roth Jr., looking very festive as he's adorned, surrounded by Christmas lights. 'Tis the season, folks. Not that he needs any dressing up, not with those smoldering eyes and that chest hair that he's known for. And I, as his son, am also known for. That's right. Diamond David Lee Roth Jr., search your heart, take one look. You know it's true that I am the son of glam, the front man for the band. Just smoked a few grams, got a million fans. I'm your ice cream man, Mr. Wop Bop, Loo Bop, Wop Bam Bam, Hot Damn, Shazam. Feeling good today. And more importantly, let me confirm it first. Yep, looking good too. And part of that comes from this. Kids, spray responsibly. Coming to you, as always, from the luscious lavender lounge of love, and joined, as always, by my friend, my confidant, my doorman, my head of security, my dope connection. Number 17 in your program, number 1 in your hearts, former New York Met great Keith Hernandez puppet. A man that says very little, obviously. But we'll get something out of him. Don't worry. He's excited. Don't let his calm demeanor fool you. This is, of course, the No Frills podcast. You get no frills because you get plenty of thrills, and that's looking at this face and this luscious coif. And also, I'm almost 50 years old, and I don't know jack squat about technology. So you see me as I invite my guests in here, and believe me, we got a good one for you today, one that I am really looking forward to, folks. Really looking forward to. It's going to get good in here. Matter of fact, let me give myself one more look here. I want to feel special for today's guest, and I want to look special. I just want everything to be special. This is a man from the literary world. We don't get a lot of highbrow guys like that here in the old pod scum. But he's just written a very good book that I want to discuss with him about a subject that you all know that I love, but we'll get into that in a minute. Let's dive into another episode of Pod Scum with another kick-ass guest. Let's get him in here. Whew. Hey, Neil, how are you?
Good.
I really appreciate it, buddy. Thank you so much for joining us, man. It's an honor.
I'm sorry.
Oh, listen. Hey, you know what? I tell all my guests all the time whenever they need to reschedule, it's like real life happens. I'm a guy with a day job like anybody else, a 50-year-old guy with a day job. You know, the podcast is not my priority. So I get to people when I get to them, you know?
I didn't want you to, it wasn't you.
Like real life, yeah, real life happens. For my guests out there that don't know, NEAL KARLEN, you've just wrote a fantastic book about Prince called This Thing Called Life. You know, and obviously you've got other accolades, other books. You've written for Rolling Stone. You've written for, I think, Newsweek. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Back in the I went from Newsweek to Rolling Stone. I think you're supposed to go the other way. My parents were, no, but yes, that's when I started writing about. It's funny. I was in Rolling Stone for 5 years, and I would write those long feature articles, and the only music articles I wrote were like the 3 cover stories I did on Prince. So
yeah,
I'm not like sort of the rock critic.
Yeah,
whatever that.
Well, that's a hard job though. Being the rock critic, I think, would carry a lot of a lot of pressure. I think because you know sometimes you got to say things that people don't always want to hear. You know.
Yeah, and people into that.
Yeah. People don't always like their art critiqued. You know.
Right. and I get that. So,
well, as a huge,
thank you for having me.
Absolutely, my pleasure. Thank you for being here. You know, as a huge Prince fan, you know, a guy who was literally the soundtrack to my life, and I was kind enough to geek out a couple weeks ago and have Dr. Fink from the Revolution Band in here. Yeah. So I did my best not to, get too ecstatic and giddy and fanboy out around him. But, I mean, when you think back to your friendship with Prince that started when you guys were very young children, something poignant that you said that you thought that people only got to see about 15% of Prince.
Right. I mean, we all compartmentalize our lives in different ways where we can be, all of us can be generous and cheap,
Right. Sure.
Loyal and disloyal. But, and I'm not judging him. It's, no one knew more than 15% of what was going on. The people who were really friends with him didn't know who each other were when he was alive. No one knew who he was going out with. So it was, I never called myself a friend of his while I was alive because I didn't think this is how friendships went, where you'd talk to someone once a week for 6 weeks and then wouldn't hear from them for a year.
Right.
It wasn't until really I finished the book, which was like 4 years after he died, that I realized this was the best he could do. That's, he was sort of fractured. We all are to a greater or lesser degree.
Sure.
But I didn't want to be one of those reporters who sort of conflate their importance with the people who they interview. So I was afraid to always go, oh yes, Prince, you know what I mean?
Right.
Even though I had letters and stuff like that where he'd call me, a friend, all that stuff. When celebrities die, suddenly they have 100 times more friends.
Right. Everybody knew him wonderfully.
Right. And so I just didn't want that conceit. But writing the book made me really, it was an act of almost mourning. And my favorite line of any review I got was, it was in Newsweek, and it wasn't like, oh, it was great how he wrote. I mean, I got enough accolades, people like also. But the line was like, it was, in the end, it was a tribute to a friend. And that made me feel good. I didn't want to feel like I'd sold him out. But also like I told the truth. I feel like I presented him, and I think that's what he wanted. After I wrote my first article, it ran in 1985. I was 25 and he was 26. He sent me a letter that's in the book where he just wrote, "Thanks for telling the truth. Love, God, Prince." And he wanted the truth. But, I mean, it wasn't just this, puff piece about him. It had a lot of harsh truth in it, but I think it's what he wanted. So I felt like I was both being loyal to the truth and loyal to him as a friend. And I hope I was, and I hope that came across.
Now, do you think that do you put yourself into that same category as somebody that had a friendship that spanned over numerous decades? Do you also are you also of the opinion that you also only knew about 15% of them?
Yes.
Yeah,
I do. I did. I purposely didn't I was lucky in that I didn't work for him because he could be real. So, but I didn't know what it was like to have him as a boss.
Right.
I think one of the, I was never his best friend, but what sort of set me apart, if anything, was the length of time I was friends with him, because I noticed people who were his best friend on Thursday, by a week from Tuesday, he'd never speak to them again.
Right.
Thing is, I never wanted anything from him. I didn't want him to produce and I was never beholden to him. And I think he liked that. I genuinely liked him as a guy. He was a good guy. A lot of people are like, that's not who I know. You can read a lot of stuff and they'll talk about how disloyal he was to people. He'd be close to someone and then he wouldn't talk to them for 40 years. And yet I knew this other side that was so loyal. Like my first time he decided to talk to me for Rolling Stone, I was a freelance. I was working for Newsweek at the time. Rolling Stone said, no, talk to the music editor instead. They went behind my back. And he said, no, I want to talk to him. He was so loyal to me. People who I trust and I believe are telling the truth will say, oh my God, he never talked to me again,
Right.
And yet my experience was so different. He was so many different people to so many different people. And And so I don't put myself in a category. Anyone who says they were his best friend or they know him totally, I think sign automatically.
Yeah.
Careful of this person, because I think anyone who claims to know him just
no, I think that's a fair assessment. I would agree with that, because even talking with Matt Fink, you know, who worked side by side and created music with him, didn't really feel like speaking to your point, kind of felt that same. Really didn't peel back a lot of layers, you know, and really get in there.
Right. And I felt, I mean, if you 15%, that encompasses a lot of people in there.
Sure.
And I think, what am I trying to say? On one hand, it sort of says, was he like not integrate? You know, he was a musician. That was the best. And he could be very tough on you if you're a musician, but he could be a very good friend too.
Yeah.
I talked to people like who he grew up with. Andre Simone, he didn't talk to for a very long time. Right. But at the end of his life, he seemed to feel a nostalgia for people he had, you know, grown up with, been close to. And it's sort of like, you know, that old saying, those who know don't say, and those who say don't know.
Right,
you know?
Right. Yeah, that's a good analogy for him. Yeah.
Right. This is Prince. This is who he was. And and part of the mystery of his genius, I mean, there is a mystery to his genius. I start the book with a quote from Albert Einstein, which seems kind of weird. But I mean, that I choose Albert Einstein, but Albert Einstein said, "It is peculiar to be so well known and yet to be so lonely."
Yeah.
And I don't say that in pity or judgment of Prince, but he was a true genius. But that separates you. I mean, I'm so glad I'm not a genius.
Right.
You know,
right. Could be a lonely place. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think he felt that. And I think by sort of segmenting his life is how he sort of dealt with that. There was all, you know, and he would try to explain it, and there was just so much going on in his head that he couldn't turn it off. He just couldn't turn it off. And I think it was both why he'll be remembered forever and why perhaps he wasn't as happy as he could have been during his lifetime. I mean, I think he could have had a happier life, but he had a great life, you know. And again, this is said without judgment or pity. I think and we're lucky to have had, you know, people say, he died before his time. It's true. But I think we're lucky to have had him for as long as we did.
Sure.
And he was in pain from the Purple Rain tour on, from when he was 26. People don't realize that. Every video they watch, every concert they watch, he is in pain since the Purple Rain tour, where he got really beat up. And he has, in the audiobook of my book, they have they reprint 20, or they have 22 tape snippets of him like a normal person, you know. And he says he just couldn't let himself rest. And he said he even though he got hurt on the Purple Rain tour several times, and he said, sometimes I felt like I could go out there and kill myself and no one would even notice. And it's both, whoa, but he just could not stop. And if you are jumping off, you know, speakers 30 feet in the air wearing platform, you're going to suffer those injuries. They were he wasn't taking drugs so he could fall asleep to take a nap. They were workplace related injuries. So I think we're lucky to have him for as long as we did.
Well, another poignant thing that I find interesting, and I don't know if this quote came from you or you put it in your book, but you say something to the effect of Prince was one of the loneliest people, but on some level he wanted to be around people, but also crave that loneliness.
Yes, and he would often say he wasn't lonely, but that he loved being alone. And I remember the very first interview I did with him, again in 1985, he showed me the plot of land where Paisley Park would be built. You know, it was out in Chanhassen. It was just like a field. And he said, it's called Paisley Park. And I said, what does Paisley Park mean? What does that stand for? And he said, it's a place where you can go to be alone. And I got this shiver down me. And I don't believe in omens, I don't usually feel these things, but it's so weird, but I got a sense just like, oh my God, he's gonna die alone there. I know that sounds ridiculous, but it's the only premonition I've ever had in my life. And of course he did. And I also had up front, I said, the only thing I know for sure about Prince after knowing him for greater or lesser degrees over 31 years was that his greatest fear, and perhaps only fear, was dying alone. Said that, and that's what happened. And it I don't know if you've seen Citizen Kane. It reminded me of he's in the big, huge, vast thing, and it makes me sad.
And it makes me sad, and I don't even have any kind of a knowledge of who he was as a person. I only get to see him, unfortunately, through his art. And I think sometimes we feel like sometimes if we're a fan of somebody that we know them more than we actually do, but I, even just being a fan of him, I could kind of sense that he was a person that wasn't always happy, though.
Yeah. I mean, he was detached. I mean, there's definitely wanted to be a rock star, he wasn't by accident. And a lot of it was, I write about his father, who I got to know and who I think was kind of jealous of Prince. And it's a terrible thing to see a parent jealous, but he had the career that the father wanted. I think he was kind of broken a little bit by his father, but I think that brokenness is what allowed that genius to get the retro rockets to push him to that success. So when you meet a young Prince and you're playing basketball and you're riding bikes and you're in the street, and I don't know if it's something you can tap into because it's obviously years and years and years ago. I don't even know if you would even be in tune with this as a young child, but what were your earliest impressions of him as a child? Well,
do you remember having any?
Lived 2 blocks away from him. And I used to go stay with them every weekend. So I didn't even remember meeting him, but he remembered me because all the kids would gather at the Dairy Queen next door to my grandparents, and I could spin a basketball on my finger and stuff like that. Just not because I was such a great basketball player, but because I was on the basketball team and I was 3rd string. And I could have been practicing the cello when the coach mattered. So I was like the only white kid there. So the first time we met, he said, I remember, I pointed out where my grandparents lived. He said, "You were Casper." That was my nickname. So I thought he was kind of just flattering me, but then he remembered that I was the white kid who could do tricks with the basketball. But at 20, I remember him very distinctly at 25, and he was just a good guy. I mean, the way we connected wasn't on this deep philosophical thing, although it was about the Minnesota Vikings and music and pro wrestling, and
guy talk.
And it was about, I used to always kid him, but it wasn't really kidding. I said, the only reason I don't think I'm really your friend, I think I'm just the only person who's up in Minneapolis at 4 in the morning. I always say, when you are who's willing and able to talk about the Vikings or suicide, and so he could go heavy or he could go deep, and we both had that ability, and we both had that sadness, and we both loved pro wrestling. You know what I mean?
Right.
Coincidence. And I was living in New York when I flew in. He didn't know I was from Minneapolis or that I was 2 blocks. It was this. I hate him going, "Oh my God, that's your." It was just this marvelous coincidence. And I feel very lucky to have known him as much as I did, even though I kind of put it down. I didn't want to be one of those, "Oh yeah, my friend Prince." Friend.
Right.
Dr. Fink, Matt and stuff. These people who worked with him hours and untold. Everyone sort of he kept a distance from everyone.
Well, when he wants to be lonely like that, though, do you get the sense, though, because another poignant thing I took away from your book was your remembrance of how much he liked to talk about, and specifically, I remember Happy Days and the Jeffersons and some of these shows where there was a good, strong nuclear family. Do you think that he was longing for a sense of family with people that he wasn't getting from his own family? because he seemed to connect with things with a family element.
You saying that is so smart. I've never thought of that, and no one, people have asked me about television shows, and I used to worry about, like, if I write about this, is this gonna, people think I'm nuts?
Well, because I know that you made a correlation about how he liked to do Fonzie impressions, and Fonzie was kind of like that, almost adopted into the Cunningham family, where almost it seems like he relates to, almost being like this, this like almost orphan child, even though he has a family, and he's looking almost to attach himself to, some kind of a familial.
Yes, and that's just, I remember interviewing Andre Simone after Prince died, and he brought up how he loved these TV shows, and it was such a relief. Like, whew.
Yeah.
People will think I'm just like making this up. But what you said about it's only hitting me that there was a nuclear family. I mean, seriously, in all those years, and I think he did. I think he did, and it's funny because this is the land of lakes, Minneapolis, they call it.
Right.
And was amazed. I remember I read an interview with Susan Rogers, his engineer, and he had bought a house on Lake Harriet, and he was amazed by that. And it wasn't, Lake Harriet is not the lake that all the rich people live around. That's Lake Isles.
Right.
Lake Harriet is known as the family. People with families live around there.
Right.
So I think you're very right, and that's very prescient, and thank you for sharing that with me.
Well, I kind of picked up on it almost immediately, because I just like you almost think of it and even if the movie Purple Rain is even autobiographical, it certainly paints a picture, however much of it is true, and certainly things weren't always, copacetic over at Prince's house. Yes,
I mean, there are things that are definitely, he said we made stuff up to kick it up. His father didn't try to commit suicide, but it's a lot truer than people realize. And in a lot of his songs, stuff comes out.
Sure.
It's amazing how he kind of blame his mother a lot. I mean, in interviews, he'd make, he would spread some BS. I mean, his mother was one of the most dignified people I've ever seen. She was a social worker in the Minneapolis public schools.
Yeah.
She wasn't, as he said, a woman who left hardcore pornography around and stuff like that.
Yeah.
But you read about abusive families, and a lot of times the kids blame the mother for not protecting them.
Right.
So, and she was so proud of him. She just go, oh, he's making,
right.
You couldn't fact check stuff with her, because she'd say whatever he said is true.
Right.
For her I couldn't ask her stuff. I'd have to wait for her to volunteer to fact check.
Right.
And stuff. But his father was, a piano player and a jazz man. And curiously enough, my great uncle Augie owned this strip joint. It wasn't like these really skeezy strip, burlesque.
Right.
Like
sure.
His father played, another connection there. And his father always he had to give up his full-time jazz career to sort of support his family. And he's kind of blamed the family for that. But he'd sort of go back and forth from loving his father to hating his father, which was a theme throughout his,
right.
If he didn't like you, he really didn't like you,
Right.
And, who knows, if he'd had a happier childhood, maybe we wouldn't have the same type of, maybe he wouldn't have had the same drive. And I don't say this out of judgment, and I just wish he could have. He had a great laugh, and he really was funny. People really say that, and I hope he got enough laughs in that 85% of the person I didn't know. But I love hearing him laugh.
So when he's calling you up at 4 o'clock in the morning, now obviously being such a high profile rock star, I'm sure that there's plenty of people that Prince could reach out to and talk to. But do you think sometimes, and well, I know he kept his circle pretty small and was extremely guarded about his personal and private life. Have you ever thought, he's maintained this relationship with you? And I know he said sometimes it would be like for a while, and then he would kind of fall off for a little while, but he seemed to keep finding his way back to you. Why you, do you think? Do you think it's because he, you know, people could be pretentious, and maybe he, you know, maybe he was weary of people, you know, who would be, you know, in the business? You know, did he see you as like, I mean, obviously you're a writer and all, journalist, but do you think he saw you as just somebody that that was really friend material?
I don't know, and I don't want to flatter myself into
Right.
but I think there's another letter that's reproduced in the book, so you can see it goes, "Please cherish our friendship as I do." And I don't know why I didn't, you know, think of him as a friend. You know, when it's in his hand,
right.
You know, and I wasn't the only one, you know, one who he would call in the middle of the night. It was one thing that a lot, you know, he'd call anybody.
Right.
It was a constant. And in my last Rolling Stone article, I rubbed it in a little. I started the article with, "The phone rings at 4:54 a.m. Hi, it's Prince. Did I wake you up?"
Yeah.
My last phone call with him, I got worried. It was 3 weeks before he died, because it was at noon or 1 in the afternoon. It was like, why is he calling me now? Why does who he called? He usually called his women friends, or his, you know, he called that. But I've never figured it out. But the most I can think is I could sort of, again, I didn't want anything. I didn't want a record contract.
Right.
I sort of need anything from him. You know, we worked on various projects together.
Right. But it sounds like the nature of the conversations he's having with you, he just kind of wanted like, you know, a normal guy friend. You know what I mean? Just like you say, not somebody who wants something, or not somebody that's connected to the business side of things, you know, where it seemed like he was reaching out for some, you know, like, you know, what we would think of as normal relationships with people.
Right. And in that
normalcy,
we would talk about, from the Minnesota Vikings to romance to suicide. You know, I think he did like that, and I certainly liked that, and I think he liked that you know, I'm not a celebrity suck. You know, I mean, I've interviewed
right.
And I purposely stopped writing about him for the last 26 years of his life.
Right.
I sort of liked that, and he asked why. You know, and I said, I was so sick of it. It became my life. Oh, that's Prince's friend. That's Prince's friend. Oh,
right.
It's all. I mean, I was losing my mind. And the thing is, I wanted to be a writer. I wanted to be more than like the court reporter. You know, and he could have said, "Well, you know, screw you." But I think he liked that I didn't want to hitch my wagon.
Right.
He wasn't my meal ticket. I mean, I didn't type his name for the last 26 years of his life, not because I hated him or whatever. I wanted to write about other things, and did, you know.
Well, it's pretty high praise too, coming from him, where, you know, he seemed to like the way you represented him in print, though, and how his voice, you know, was conveyed through you.
Yeah, like while he was alive, he blew up the cover of the first Rolling Stone article I did with him, which he actually hated the picture. He wouldn't pose for pictures. It was a still taken from the Raspberry Beret video.
Okay.
And he claimed Rolling Stone had put spaces between his teeth, but he blew it up and put it outside his office. It was on the tour for about a year at Paisley Park. They took it down then when they but you can find on paisleypark.com or whatever that's what he had up there. So he wanted to be reminded of that, I guess. And it was this story where he drove me around Minneapolis.
Right.
And the whole thing took place in his Thunderbird. And I guess he did. I didn't know that he had that first article blown up and put outside his office.
Yeah, it's pretty cool.
Alive. And it was only after he's died that they took it down, you know.
And now, when you're having these conversations with them, how much of it is just like these very generic conversations about sports, you know, broad stroke conversations about life? Does he ever confide much in you? Like, say, around the time when he loses the baby, do you ever get a personal glimpse? Does he ever use you as like a shoulder to cry on, or somebody to ask advice from? Do you get a sneak peek? How deep does how deep does he go with you?
It felt like pretty deep. I didn't feel like, oh, I am his confidant. I am his Prince whisperer. But we only talked about the baby once. I have a whole chapter on that. And that was but you read about stuff. He never talked about the baby to anyone. I mean, I think it was an event that I talked about, it like kind of broke him in a very severe way. So he was used to not talking about stuff, and when things were but they didn't feel like superficial. If they were, I wouldn't want to talk to him at in the morning.
Well, and it was very painful to watch when Oprah did the interview with him. It was painful to watch because at that point in time, watching it back now, you know that the baby has already passed, but Prince is kind of, you know, keeping up this facade that things are kind of hunky dory.
Right, and he did that with Oprah. My gosh,
I know
that the baby had died. But if you know, the audiobook sold well because you can hear him going deep and you know, you can hear him as a real person talking about stuff, and I'm glad that exists. It's sort of like I have the receipts, sort of, to you know,
absolutely,
suicide and the Vikings and all that. It just and he's not talking in that weird sort of Martian voice he'd sometimes use. He sounded like a real person, and he was a real person. You know, but he could hide behind that facade. So I felt like there was a real person there. I had no need to talk to a famous person diving me. You know, it's not a need of mine, and I don't get off on that.
And so you said that you were aware that he was in pain since back around the Purple Rain album and the Purple Rain tour. Are you aware of drug use though?
No, I was.
No.
I write about the one time I had broken my leg in 5 places in 1997.
Yep.
And he, I just write about how he bummed some of my Percocet.
Yep.
But it didn't seem like a drug addict at all. So I really wasn't. And other people have said they were, but they really had much more day-to-day stuff. And you know, the cause of death may be fentanyl, but it really was overwork. You know, he didn't need to be jumping off speakers like that his whole life. He really felt this need to put on a show. And he said if he'd had an inner voice going, no, 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 I'll tell you when to stop. And it's not time yet. So I never was aware to the extent that it seemed that he was, you know, and I don't feel like I'm loyal to say that it seems that he was. You know, a lot of Prince stans are out there going, no, no, how can you can't even say, but you know, the autopsy says what was, and there are enough people who were around to say what was, but I don't think he died of, I think it was workplace related injuries over 30 years that killed him.
Collateral damage.
It was a variety of events that killed him.
Now I don't know much about your personal life as far as like you having a spouse or kids of your own or whatever. You a family man?
I'm divorced and I don't have kids. And I think it was sort of I write in there that remembering about when we're 25, when I said, when we both thought we were going to have kids and family, you know, I'm with someone now who has kids and stuff, but I don't have my own kids. And I always imagined that I would. Prince always did. So it was a common thread. Why can't we, you know,
so
not like, woe is me, but it was something else we had in common where things didn't, you know, turn out the way we thought they would, not being self-kidding.
Because my question was, you know, obviously, you know, circumstances of your lives, you know, vastly different. Whatever's going on in your life might be different than what's going on in his life. But, you know, were you somebody that he ever came to and ever asked any advice on anything? Like, that was the point I was going to get at. Did he ever ask any parenting advice or, you know, any kind of stuff like when he was going to have the baby? Or did he ever come to you just for any, you know, did he ever pick your brain for any kind of advice?
Yeah, I mean, we talked about relationship stuff. I mean, it wasn't so much advice like what should I do, but it was like we could empathize with each other. Things we both had years-long relationships that didn't work, and I would complain about you know, I mean, we could empathize with each other, and we both had been through those experiences together. So I think that built trust too. But I don't remember him ever doing a you know, what should I
Right.
do. He kept his own console there. But I think me going, woe is me, why does this not work out? You know,
Right.
we could relate to each other that way.
Was he somebody that was, were you somebody that he vented too much when he was going through his now famous, you know, skirmish there with Warner Brothers where he's trying to get out of the contract, and when he became the, you know, the symbol and he was writing slave on his face? That obviously seemed to be a very tumultuous time in his career. Left a lot of fans scratching their heads as to what to call him and what was going on with him. Did he ever express any frustration about that situation to you?
Yeah, he did. I mean, he hired me to write this testament why he was, in 1993, why he was changing his name.
Yeah.
He paid me to interview him, and I wanted him to pay me because then I couldn't write about him again. He would have paid, you know.
Right.
So he did. And incredibly frustrated, both with Warner's, but also at that time, he thought the music world had passed him by. He'd always been on the cutting edge. And suddenly rap was going, you know, he was behind the curve. So he was incredibly frustrated. So yes, he did. And I reprint in the book, you know, the transcript of what I wrote, which, you know, he said he was burying in a time capsule, which I believe because he paid me and he tended to go through with things that he paid for. So yes, and he was incredibly frustrated, both with Warner Brothers and himself, because he saw people doing stuff beyond what he was doing. And he was always the one who was on the cusp of the latest thing. So he did. And it was right at 1990, and when he did change his name, and he wanted to explain why. And now everybody's changing their name from, but people forget how revolutionary, and people thought he was nuts for going against Warner Brothers and changing his name. I mean, they really did, but it's funny how in retrospect, it doesn't seem as cuckoo as it did at the time.
Yeah. I think it left a lot. Well, and he did say, he did say famously, I believe, in a Larry King interview that I remember a bunch of years back, where he really explained like the impetus as to why he did that. And do you think though do you think ultimately that was, I mean, it wound up working pretty good for him, but Larry King had made the point that usually when you get famous with a name, very rarely after you branded yourself or whatever, do you rarely go against that, you know what I mean, and kind of change kind of type or whatever, you know. So it was a pretty unorthodox move and certainly could have been very risky. Is it anything that he ever, you know, that he ever asked for feedback on? Because obviously he did some things that sometimes a public persona could say, you know, you certainly wouldn't be surprised to hear people thinking Prince was strange sometimes.
Yes. No, I mean, I thought it was nuts, you know. It's hard enough to give people what they want, you know, get people to get over, you know, give them what they don't want.
Right. And you're 20 years into a career and you're known as Prince, you know, and then all of a sudden you're kind of backpedaling on that, and now all of a sudden you're an unpronounceable symbol. That seems weird. Yeah.
And but he'd always known when it was time to change. He said one of the most depressing days was when Purple Rain, the movie, came out, and the gross receipts came out on Monday, and he had the #1 record, the #1 song, cover of everything, and he knew he had to break up the revolution because it would never get better than this. So he knew he had to start over. So he always had a pretty firm sense of that. And when he decided something, he really, and he said Prince is dead in 1993. You know,
he did.
And he felt he couldn't go any further with that incarnation, and people couldn't believe it. But he didn't want to be playing Prince oldies when he was 60.
Right.
And so he felt he had to do that to survive.
Right.
And I can
see it again. Yep. Well, you know, obviously he's known for being a perfectionist in the studio. I talked with this about Dr. Fink. You know, really knew what he wanted in the studio. Was certainly could rule with an iron fist. You know, was certainly could be a taskmaster. Probably even a workaholic. But you know, in a short amount of time, and I'm calling his career short. It was obviously very long. But you know, but to put out 39 albums and now a couple, have come out posthumously or whatever. But during his living years, 39 albums is quite a back catalog. Was he ever able to turn off the creative side of him, or was he kind of like this mad genius that just always, was just always creatively inspired?
Yeah, and I think it was what it kind of tortured him, and
because that could be maddening. Yeah, I could see
mad genius. I think of like a cuckoo, but he would talk about how he wished he could turn off the thoughts in his head. He said, I'm always thinking, I could work with this person, I could do that album, I could do this concept.
Right.
So he couldn't turn it off. So I think it almost drove him mad, and it was the horrors of being a genius again.
Right.
He just didn't want to repeat himself. And so he did 39 albums, and they're all very different. He said it was early on. He said, wouldn't it be cool to be able to put all your albums in a row and have each one go to a different place? Yeah. And they did. But I think it is also a testament that he couldn't turn it off, and how maddening it really was. Just I mean, I have that problem, just thoughts pinging in my head.
Me too.
And I love running because it's the only time, huffing and puffing around the lake, where I can just where my mind is blank.
Sure.
And I'm not equating myself at all with him. I'm just saying,
right,
with always stuff running around your head, you know what I mean? It's such a relief.
Yeah, I do.
Have some way to turn it off. And I don't know if he ever found a way to turn it off.
Now, obviously, speaking to that point with him being so prolific, also out of all those albums, there were some that were commercially and critically, which you could call flops or panned by critics or whatever. Under the Cherry Moon, a movie that I will always go on record and say that I love, but was overall panned by critics. Do you look back on Prince's career? Are you able to say, geez, here's a couple of missteps he made?
Oh, definitely. Yeah. And if you look at the week he died, his sales went up 44,000%. He had 4 of the top 10 albums.
Yep.
That's amazing. But when you think how few albums he was selling the week before, for something to go up 44,000%,
Yeah, I saw it here too. Here in upstate New York, the record stores had all of a sudden on displays, and his stuff was pushed out to the front again. And
yeah, and I'm not a fan, but there are ones that I just don't get, and I don't like, and that's not a put down of him. Same thing with Bob Dylan or the Rolling Stones. They're just
sure.
And but he did leave stuff that I think in 50 years, I don't think it's, people throw the word genius around so easily, but I think people still will be listening to Prince albums in 50 years and writing books about.
No question. No question.
I wanted one place at least where they knew the quotes were real. He really did say, and you can hear them on the the tapes. But yes, no, the quality is definitely there. It goes up and down, and I don't think that's being disloyal to him or his memory to say that.
But is he somebody who because obviously either people can be their own hardest critics, or they can think that everything that they touch turns to gold. I feel like Prince, on some level, was Prince aware, and could he differentiate between the albums that maybe weren't as good as the other ones? Or is he one of those kind of guys that just says, all my albums are fucking great, or is he one of those guys that could say, geez, you know what? Yeah, I can see why people didn't like this one.
Yeah, I mean, he wasn't one who like every single thing I do is great, but he did think he was pretty good, but he was very aware that he could do this, what he did on Purple Rain over and over again. He said, how easy it would be to change the opening chord to Let's Go Crazy. That would have been, and just do another song the same. It would have been different, but it would have gone to #1. He was very aware that he could have just done the same thing over and over and over again. And he was aware that not everything was great, but he could say what he was trying to do differently.
Right.
So that was important to him, that he was trying to do something differently.
Yeah.
But he didn't think each one had the same power as the previous ones. And so he wasn't sort of drunk on his own talent.
Right. Now, obviously, you've had conversations with him. I find him to be in interviews that I've seen with him, with Tavis Smiley, or the few people he would grant interviews to. He's obviously a highly articulate, very intelligent, very well read, very well studied guy. Do you think any of the stuff, like for instance, when you look back at a song like "Sign of the Times," he's talking about AIDS, he's talking about the crack epidemic, he's talking about things that we're on the almost on the precipice of, that haven't even started yet. Do you think he was, do you think he was almost prophetic at times?
Yes, I do. I mean, he also kept up with it. I mean, sometimes you could talk to him and you think, what is this guy talking about, when he'd be talking about the Illuminati running the world? But sometimes you could tell he had just read the New York Times. I mean, his song "Baltimore" about Freddie Gray.
Right.
I just wish he had. I'm sort of grateful he didn't live to see George Floyd die.
I know.
In Minneapolis. But then I think, oh my God, think of the music that would have been a soundtrack. I don't mean like, oh, what a commercial opportunity for him. But I think he could have helped us make sense of that tragedy. I think it would have broken his heart that it happened in his beloved Minneapolis.
Yeah.
But I don't think he was a prophet in a weird, biblical but he was very aware of what was going on in the world. And he was very socially conscious, especially as time went on and at the end. So,
now, when he loses the baby and he's with Maite, it wasn't too long after that when they separated. Seemed like the marriage just couldn't sustain the loss of the child. But knowing Prince the way you know him, because after that he had a second marriage and that did work out. Could Prince be a married guy?
I don't know. I don't know what. He was definitely kind of a dog, but he was always a gentleman. You know, I think he wanted that. I don't think he could have settled down to be Ward Cleaver.
Right. Definitely not.
But yes, he could be in love. Could he be in love with one woman? I don't know.
Right.
I know he wanted that and he searched for that. I don't know if he could have pulled it off the way,
Right.
It was hard. By the end, he had shut out so many people from his whole life. Like, he kept getting older, but the people stayed the same age.
Right.
Around him. And I honestly don't know. So I have to plead ignorance.
That's all right. That's all right. Why do you think he played so much into the, and I don't know if he ever shed any light on this in his conversations with you, but, and I guess to a certain extent, I have heard in interviews, the Oprah one, that I mentioned earlier, where he talked about there being another person inside of him and being in touch with his feminine side, but he really seemed to play up that, androgynous side. Did he ever tell you why? Was it deliberate? Was there an intention behind it?
Yeah, I mean, I think at the beginning he definitely played it up as for the controversy of it. But he got along with women very well. He was able to have he was really able to empathize, and women were amongst his best friends. So I think he understood the women's point of view, but he was a guy, he was definitely a guy. People would say, so many interviews say, was he gay?
Right.
No, I never met a straighter man in my life, but he really could empathize with women and have real conversations with them. So I think it just speaks to the breadth of his to have interpersonal relationships.
And I implore people to go out and read your book, because, speaking to your point about the conversations you've had with them, I think if people do want to put that particular issue to rest in their own heads, they needn't do anything more than listen to your conversations, because he very much does come off as a guy's guy.
Yeah.
He really does. Just a regular guy shooting the shit with another guy.
Jerk dick, but like,
right. So when he passes in 2016, where are you when you get the news?
I'm in Minneapolis, and my girlfriend is my phone kept but I turned it off. I just hear buzzing.
Right.
I found my girlfriend is banging on my door to tell me, and I just sort of if you had told me the day before, I would feel so whipsawed by the death of
Yeah.
pop star, I would have said you're nuts. But man, the whole town just, it reminded me again, it's nothing new,
Right.
of how people talk about how they felt when they heard Kennedy got shot. It really,
yeah.
I just thought, my knees went out from underneath me. Where were you? How did you hear about it?
I'm a nurse by day. That's my day job. Me and my son were going to work. We worked at the same nursing home. We worked a 3 to 11 shift. Happened to stop by my mom's house because we had a little bit of time before we had to be to work. We'd stop down there sometimes and raid the fridge or whatever. Just scrolling through on my phone, just found out on social media, and then I went to check a couple of other sources, like, because you do see a lot of that fake bullshit on some of these sites. Oh, so-and-so died or so-and-so, So, I wanted to make sure. And, I'll be honest with you, Neil, I've lost, I'm sure we all have. You spoke about Kennedy. There's been other musicians. There's been other people that have done art and work that has certainly, spoken to me and moved me. But it's probably the only time that an artist that I was ever a fan of died that I actually had tears in my eyes.
Yes. No, same thing. It was just like, I couldn't believe how awful I felt and for how long.
Yeah.
It took me 3.5 years to write this book, and I was like grief stricken the whole thing,
Yeah.
I needed to do it. And, it wasn't easy to write, and it wasn't for the day. It was like I needed to grieve that way by putting into words and figuring out what was this? Who was this guy?
So in a way, writing the book was cathartic for you as well.
Oh, very much so. Very much. And it was an act of mourning and grieving, and I needed to do it. And I needed to be loyal to him too, but also authentic. I didn't want to write some bullshit book. I didn't want to, it's true, but it's not like I don't go after him at all, but there's harsh truths in there, I think.
And do you think that, he was a guy who could, because I get the impression that he's not, but maybe you can verify this. Certainly not a guy who seemed like he trusted very easily.
No.
Other people.
No. And with good reason. So many people sold him out. And God, I still remember the first time I was driving around Minneapolis when I was 25 and him putting a version of the unreleased version of Old Friends for Sale on.
Yep.
That's the story. He got sold out over and over and over again. And in writing this, I just didn't want to be another old friend for sale.
Right. Well, and one good thing that I'm glad that you did do, because I think this is imperative, at least for me, in my opinion, when someone tells their story. I love that you narrated the audiobook yourself. That for me is a big selling point, because I think nobody really tells a story and really knows where to put inflections in their voice and emphasis on certain parts of the story better than the person who was there and lived it.
Oh, thank you. I'm so glad I did. And it's weird. I just remember that week of recording it and the number of times I just burst into tears, and it was embarrassing. There's like an engineer in a recording. There was points I expect, but it's like you're supposed to be the total professional, and I would just lose it. So thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for the book. And obviously, when Prince died, there was a lot of anticipation that he was writing his own memoirs, which obviously abruptly came to an end with his untimely passing. We did get a book that was ultimately finished by the estate, but really the first couple of chapters are really only his words. Do you think that's a project he would have seen all the way through and put his life out there in book form?
I think so, but he was going to bullshit his way. I talked about the guy who collaborated with it when it came out. My girlfriend went up to him and said, "Oh, hi, I'm Neal Karlen." And he said, "Oh God, wasn't Neal writing a book with him?" And he had asked me to do it, but I've written celebrity autobiography. It's a terrible process. You're just stuck I didn't want to do it, and I know he wanted to bullshit his way. He wanted to muddy his story. So I just had gotten tired of I'd done a few different celebrity autobiographies, and you're just stuck in the middle. But I think he would have seen it through, and I kind of like that book.
I do too. Yeah,
I think it's interesting what the guy wrote, and I think the photos and Paisley Park, I thought there was a lot of interesting stuff in there. I thought it was a worthy addition to the Prince, stuff out there.
And it's certainly high on my, it's
certainly
high.
How honest he would have been in the long run.
Yeah.
But I think as it sits now, it's a worthy addition to the Prince library.
Yeah. Now, what do you think was public perception wise? I'm speaking here. What do you think the biggest misconception of Prince was?
That he was out of his mind. You know, that he always knew exactly what he was doing.
Yeah, I could see that.
And that he was humorless. That he was sort of.
That's all right. There you go.
My phone is about.
That's all right.
I've got. If we cut off, I'm not angry.
That's all right.
That he wasn't really human. That he didn't have emotions. He was very emotional. He was not nuts. He was not this character. You know, the way people look at Michael Jackson is almost like a subhuman or
you're right,
not of this world,
alien or something. Yeah,
of this world, and he very much cared about this world.
Yeah.
So, and he was very, very, very smart. And so I think the conception that he was either viewed himself as a brother from another planet or was a brother from another planet is not true. He was very human. He was a guy, and he was a likable guy. If you could get through that stuff,
penetrate those walls. Yeah. Now I want to ask before we wrap up here, I try to do this with all my guests, completely separate from Prince. Best piece of advice that you've ever been given?
That is a great question.
Yeah.
By one or by Prince?
By anybody. By anybody. Yeah. Oh, hey, if Prince gave you some advice, that'd be great.
Mark, that is such a good question. I'm going to be thinking about that for days. What have other people said? I'm curious.
Well, I'm trying to wrap it up each interview, like, and eventually, hopefully, and I've done a lot of these, maybe string together, some compilations of the best pieces of advice that people have given. One of the best ones that I had, and I get a lot of guys from bands on here. A guy the other day told me from the legendary metal band Raven, who took Metallica out on their first national tour. John Gallagher told me that his father gave him the best piece of advice ever when he was little, and he said it was just one word: think.
Yes.
Before everything, think.
What I'm thinking of is something my mother said to me, and something my father said: "Don't go where you're not invited." I thought that was interesting.
And my
mother said, "People aren't thinking about you as much as you think they are."
Those are both great. I love both of those. Yeah, that's a good way to end it. That's a great way. I love both those pieces of advice. Listen, you have written what I consider here, as you mentioned at the top of the interview, where people were quoted as saying, well, I think you've written a beautiful book and a love letter to a friend.
Thank you, Mark. That means a lot to me.
It's a beautiful book. I implore people to go out and it's called this thing called life. What is it? Prince's Odyssey, on and off the record.
Yeah. Thank you so much, and thank you for your time. And
thank you for your time. I really appreciate you taking the time. And people can find you and your work. Where are you on Instagram? All the places where people can find people.
I'm on Facebook and
Neal Karlen's everywhere.
Yeah, nealkarlen.com. And Google me, or the book's on Amazon and stuff like that. So
we're not going to get a David Lee Roth book then, right? We're not getting a David Lee Roth book anytime soon. Because I am Diamond Dave Jr. here, as you can tell.
Yes, I can tell.
I know you could. Hey, listen, any guy that wrote for Rolling Stone can obviously tell a rock god when he sees one.
I worship at your altar.
Thank you. That means the world to me. No, listen, you've written a great book, and I implore people to go out and read it. I love that you narrated it yourself. It's a really well-written, beautiful book, man. And, we will continue to mourn Prince and miss Prince, but thank God he's given us so much great work that we'll have for the rest of our lives. And you're right, his music will stand the test of time.
Message me,
Yeah, and I will stay in touch. Hopefully we can do this again sometime.
That would be great, Mark.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Neil. I really appreciate it. Thank you, sir.
All right. Take care, man.
Have a good one. Thank you.
See you
later. Now we get to watch him try to hang up. That's my favorite part. There he goes, folks. Neal Karlen finally figured out how to log off of this call that he's in with me. That is Neal Karlen. He's written some fantastic books. Let me give his accolades one more time. I know I gave him at the beginning of the show. Former contributing editor at Rolling Stone. He's written for Newsweek. He's been a contributor to the New York Times. And what he has done recently this year is written a fantastic book on his childhood friend, the great Prince. Please go out. I implore people to go out and check the book out. It's called This Thing Called Life, Prince's Odyssey, on and off the record. You will hear interviews and excerpts of interviews with the man's voice himself in conversation with Neal. Neal was a friend, a confidant, somebody that Prince would ring up in the middle of the night and shoot the shit with for decades and decades. I think their career or their friendship spanned 30 plus years. So this is a guy that was there from the beginning and knew Prince and, you know, probably got into his personal life and through some of those walls a lot better than a lot of people did. So that is Neal Karlen. I urge you to go check out his, he's written books on other rock stars and other celebrities too, but go check out that Prince book, This Thing Called Life. Hope you guys enjoyed that episode of Pod Scum. And as always, remember to take it easy and keep it sleazy.